Good morning, Miss Evans. The four poems in my anthology, Impressions of Australia, reflect varying Australian cultural perspectives. In this anthology, which your publishing house should adopt, reflects changing ideologies towards Australia. The four poems which are included in this anthology are Australia, written by A.D. Hope, The Poor, Poor Country, written by J. Shaw Nelson, Jim Jones, written by an anonymous writer, and The Shearer's Wife, written by Lewis Essen. My anthology will make you think about Australia differently, as people take it for granted, and some do not even appreciate it at all. These poems are going to show you how Australia used to be and what is becoming of this once beautiful land. The poem Jim Jones is about a convict who was sent to Botany Bay after committing a crime in England. The point of view is reflected in the poem from Jim Jones. The convict does not like the idea of going to Botany Bay because he will have to slave around all day. He hated the idea of going to Botany Bay so much that he would have rather joined the pirate ship which attacked their convict ship that they were travelling on to Botany Bay. There are a range of poetic techniques in the poem Jim Jones, such as alliteration and rhyme. In this poem, the name of the convict Jim Jones is named and used as alliteration throughout the poem and in the title. The rhyme scheme of Jim Jones is AABBCC. This representation of Australia reflects on how convicts and first settlers came to Australia to live. The convicts did not like living in Australia or working hard like slaves because they were always told what to do. This perspective is important to Australia because our history with convicts and coming to Australia and working in the farms and making the buildings for our first settlers. The poem Australia, written by A.D. Hope, contains a rhyme scheme of A-B-B-A. The poem describes Australia's landscape as very dry, but it never used to be like this, because there was sea islands among inland islands. The land has been destroyed and looks worn away, which is not pleasant to look at. The poet thinks that the people who arrived in Australia are inhabiting the dying earth, and they are draining the land and not treating it with respect. There are a number of poetic techniques used in this poem, including personification, simile, metaphor, and alliteration. An example of personification is, she is the last of lands, and an example of simile is, and her 5 cities like 5 teeming sores. This supports that the earth is dying. A sample of alliteration in the poem is last of lands. The poet does not have a negative view of Australia, but the Yurrin people who colonise the land and don't have any spiritual connection to the land and only see it as a resource. The Shearer's Wife, written by Lewis Essen, is from the point of view of the wife farmer. The poem describes what it is like to work on a farm and being alone. The woman has to do all the work because she has no one else to help her. She is alone. The woman does not have it easy because she has to do everything by herself on the farm. She has to support herself doing all the regular things as well as working on the farm. She has to go food shopping, and that's not very nice. Lonely in the bush, and lonely I stare down the track, no horses draw near. This quote indicates that the woman is very lonely. The poetic techniques in The Shearer's Wife is rhyme, alliteration, and personification. An example of the poetic technique alliteration in this poem is droving dust, and another poetic technique personification is the moon is lonely in the sky. These support that the woman is very lonely. She has the rural Australian life, as her life is all work and hardly gets to rest or play. This is the Australian way. The narrator in The Poor, Poor Country, written by J. Shaw Nelson, thinks the poem's landscape is very dry and suggests nothing really grows in the harsh Australian environment. The narrator of this poem is not rich in terms of money. Nevertheless, he considers himself wealthy. because he lives in the beautiful landscape which makes him happy. The mood of the poem is high-spirited and joyful because of the way the poet describes the land. The images that this poem conjures up about Australian landscape are evocative. The poet describes the colour of the water and the leaves, the birds singing and feeding their young, and the birds flying away until there was only sky. The poetic techniques used in this poem are alliteration, personification, rhyme, and metaphor. An example of alliteration in this poem is ducks down. An example of personification in this poem is the new year came with heat and thirst. This example tells us that the earth needs to be looked after. The poet refrains, "No pauper was I," throughout the poem. The rhyme scheme in this poem is AABB. The cultural perspective provided in this poem is significant because the people very rarely get to visit this part of Australia's landscape, as the majority of the people in this country live in the city or suburbs and don't get to experience the bush. The bush is a part of Australia's history and should be visited. My anthology, Impressions of Australia, has now shown you reflecting Australian cultural perspectives. The 4 poems Australia, written by A.D. Hope, The Poor, Poor Country, written by J. Shaw Nelson, and Gin Jones, written by an anonymous writer, and The Shearer's Wife, written by Lewis Essen, has made you think about Australia differently, as not all people see Australia the same. But hopefully now you will show some respect to Australian culture. These different cultures have led us to believe that the land has been dying since our first settlers arrived here. We need to have the right impression of Australia. These poems have changed me and encouraged my anthology. I hope you accept my anthology and cultural perspectives. Thank you for listening to my speech.